Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast, the series that dials in on some of the basic tenets, principles, and overall ideas in Army doctrine. Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Dean, and today we're going to have the Army's longest-running chicken and egg discussion, which is intelligence, operations, and who drives who. And with me today are three individuals who are probably perfectly suited to have this doctrinal debate with. First of all, it's Major General Anthony Hale, Commanding General from the U.S. Army's Intelligence Center of Excellence out of Fort Huachuca. And we're also privileged to have with us our first brave warrant officer to come onto the podcast, CW5 Aaron Anderson, Chief Warrant Officer for the MI Corps. And of course, returning to the podcast is Mr. Rich Creed, Director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate here at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nikki. Good to be here.
Good to be here.
Thanks, Nikki.
So, I think if you asked any Army leader, they're probably going to admit that one of the hardest things to do is to manage transitions. And we have a number of listeners that have served in the Army that has been optimized for the global war on terror. And we're now serving through another transition, which is the modernization for multi-domain operations and armed conflict against potential peer threats. Back in 2017, CAC published our current edition of FM30, and Doctrine defined further that transition with unified land operations and LSCO, large-scale combat operations. And as the force had a common lexicon, we began thinking and talking about future operating environments and capabilities gaps and required resourcing. And the Intel Center, it was really no different in 2017. They also examined and refined their doctrine, their training, force structure, added new systems technologies, everything to the Army's kit bag. And now we fast forward to 2021, and we've got a new draft of FM30, currently out for the force for review and comments, and the Intelligence Center is back doing what they do best, like all the COEs, and they're aggressively pushing ahead on updating their doctrine, as well as continuing all the equipment and force modernizations efforts that started about 5-6 years ago. So I think it's really, really important for us to talk about how that transition went back in 2017 and discuss how we got here today. And I'd like to kind of set the stage for the listeners by addressing how the transition to LSCO and MDO impacted the intelligence community relative to operations. And I really want to begin with Mr. Creed because, sir, you were here back when CAD went live with LSCO in 2017 and FM30 was published. What did you see, or what effects did that have on our centers of excellence and their modernization and their doctrine at the time?
Thanks, Nikki. So I think one thing that we want to consider is the purpose for which we published FM30 in 2017. We hadn't had an FM30 for about 5 years at that point. At the time that we did away with it, there was an assessment that it was a redundant publication and we didn't need to have it. The Army Chief of Staff at the time, General Milley, although the idea and the seeds were planted with General Odierno, asked what our doctrine was to deal with big wars against big threats, or what we'd call large-scale combat operations against peer threats like a Russia, a China, or in a certain context, maybe in Iran or North Korea. And we, quite frankly, didn't have any doctrine for that. And so it was actually an intelligence community assessment of the operational environment. And, this is prior to the 2017 or 2018 NDSS that talked about the return of great power competition. Now, while that wasn't in the NDS, within TRADOC and the Intel community, we were looking at the world that way in the context of what was going on, for example, in the South China Sea or the Korean Peninsula, and certainly with the Russian behavior in the Crimea and the Ukraine. And so the whole basis of why the Army changed its focus in terms of readiness was based on an intelligence assessment to begin with. So I just wanted to set that up first. So we published FM30, and it was intended to drive a certain amount of cultural change. We'd been doing certain types of operations for about 20 years at various scales and scopes. But Afghanistan and Iraq obviously were the main focus for what Army forces were focused on, and our doctrine and the rest of our .mil-PF construct kind of adapted over time in that direction. It evolved, right? And so what had changed was that you had to start to deal with threats who can do things to us that we were accustomed to doing to other people, essentially uncontested. And so that kind of starts that seeds towards thinking about a multi-domain view of the operational environment, right? So we're used to being uncontested in the air and the maritime domains. We'd be contested in cyberspace, but not during the execution of military operations, and we weren't really contested in space, although we had competition there. And so those were all things that we were asked to address. And when you create something new like that, that's a radical repurposing of priorities for the Army, because it was the Army Chiefs of Staff's guidance that our readiness priority would be large-scale combat operations, with Russia being the pacing threat and China being the long-term threat. That had a real ripple effect on all the rest of the doctrinal publications that are arranged in a hierarchy from the Army doctrinal publications, 15 across the top, and then 50-odd field manuals in the middle, and several hundred, 250 ATPs. And obviously you can't change all of that at one time. It takes a long time. We're still changing doctrine and updating it even 3.5 years later. But we had to set some priorities, and so the priorities would have been the Army doctrinal publications, those first 15 across the top, and then some of the key FMs as well. General Walters at the time was the commandant down at the Intelligence Center, and because intelligence should drive operations, he thought it very important that FM20 be the first one out of the hopper, with ADP 20 obviously being done simultaneously. And so I think that's what the priorities were back then, and those are the reasons why.
So, General Hale and Mr. Anderson, you guys were there, intelligence professionals watching this occur within your field. What did that transition look like for the intelligence community, and how was it handled?
Well, Nikki, I think first off, it's great to be here doing my second podcast. But for me, I've got to go back 33 years. So I first put on the uniform 33 years ago in 1988. So for my first decade in the Army, I was doing large-scale combat operations. And I'll go back to my time in the 24th ID in 1993 to 95, where I had 6 NTC rotations in 2 years. And we were getting after then the Krasnovians fighting large-scale combat operations. So for 31 years now as an MI officer, being a 35 Delta, basically an all-source analyst. I've worked at the tactical to strategic level. I've got 7 years deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, of course prior to that Bosnia and Kosovo, and I've served at Echelon, Battalion Brigade Command, but the FORCECOM G2, JSOC J2, Resolute Support J2 in Afghanistan, and the SOCOM J2 as a combatant command before coming to ICO. And for senior leaders, I think that it's not necessarily something new because we've lived through major changes in the Army before. When I got to the Intelligence Center of Excellence, the first thing I was told was, sir, this is the largest modernization of the Intel Corps in the equipping side of the house than we've ever done in 40 years. And I kind of scratched my head because that was before I came in the Army. But, as we've looked and moved from COIN over the last 2 decades, and we started to move toward large-scale combat operations and multi-domain operations, I think initially for the Intel Corps, looking at the 17 gaps that were identified, gap number 1 is deep sensing. And to get after large-scale combat operations, it's not looking through a soda straw, looking at an HVT like we've been doing for the last 2 decades with MQ-9s and Predators. It's how do you see a formidable threat coming at you in a combat formation where they're going to go force on force, just like I was doing at NTC when I first came in the Army. Rich mentioned that General Walters, then the CG at Fort Huachuca and the Intel Center, wanted to get after FM20 very quickly. And I think as we started the process of updating 2.0 And now, of course, we've got the new Draft 3.0 out on the streets, which will in turn cause us to update 2.0 in some respects. For the Intel Center and for the Intel warfighting function, it really started us the process of changing our training in the institutional Army. And when I got to Fort Huachuca, I asked the question, when's the last time we've changed some of the training for our MOSs? And I got the answer of, well, it's been a decade or two. And my question back was, how often do you update your iPhone? You update your iPhone every 2 to 3 years. Most folks aren't like me, and I don't update it but every 5 years. But we need to update our training to ensure that our soldiers, and we train from private to colonel at Fort Huachuca, that our soldiers are current in the doctrine. So we had to get after that. So I think, that process of learning from experience and knowledge, going through big changes in the Army in my career, I think senior leaders is nothing new to us. But it does focus us in our warfighting function. And, we've got to look at experience as we update our doctrine. And I'll pass it over to my partner in crime here, Chief Anderson, because, he's got 3 decades in uniform as well. He started off as an enlisted soldier, went to be an officer, and then resigned his commission and came into the Intel Corps as a warrant officer. And now he's a CW5, so he's got great experience. Chief, over to you.
A genuine unicorn.
Yes, he is.
Right. That's right. Well, I appreciate that intro, sir. And, ma'am, thank you very much. It's great to be here today. As General Hale mentioned, this modernization is maybe one of the 2 big inflection points that I've seen throughout the course of my career. So I'm a 350 Fox by trade, all-source intelligence technician. Pretty diverse background, served at our Intelligence and Security Command, served at ForceCom, within ForceCom formations, and then at TRADOC as well. So I'd set the table going back to maybe the mid-90s, where we had a force that was very capable to fight the air-land battle. We moved into a period after 9/11 where we went coin-centric, so that was pretty heavy for Intel in terms of human intelligence and counterintelligence, doing a lot of personality-based targeting. And then I found myself in 2014 actually sitting in Afghanistan when the Russians went into Crimea. And I think it was at that point that the Army looked at itself and realized we probably need to do another evaluation. And the Chief of Staff of the Army directed a study group over to Europe, looked at where we were and what we were doing, looked at what the enemy was doing, realized that, well, we've been fighting coin, they've been looking at us and identifying our gaps, and so realized that we needed to change. Moving up to 2015, doing a joint force entry exercise with 18th Airborne Corps as a senior analyst, that's when I first started to hear the terms large-scale combat operations and multi-domain operations. Moving to 2016, did 2 warfighters, and I think by 2016 we already had an eye and were postured to looking to large-scale combat operations, multi-domain operations. And then in 2018, I found myself as a platform instructor at the schoolhouse at Fort Huachuca. And some of the things I noticed there were that we had really taken a look at the program of instruction that we had, and we made a concerted effort to change the POI from COIN to LISCO. We started providing classes in Russian New Generation Warfare as they were the pacing threat at the time. We remodeled the MI pre-command course to have touch points that dealt with where our current adversaries were at. And then as part of the warrant officer training branch, we really took the exercise, the date compliant exercise that we had, and we rescoped that and made sure it was relevant and compliant with large-scale combat operations. So I saw just a myriad of changes in a very short amount of time, 2017, 2018, 2019, as we turned towards LISCO. So
it's kind of funny, sir, that you brought up the whole, for you, this wasn't a significant change. This is something that harkened back to what you remember. And I think that was also another thing that I found when I started digging back through the intelligence doctrine, is this really deep discussion and also a really good understanding of fighting for intelligence. And I have a deep appreciation for FM20, the one that came out of the 2017 revision time period, especially Chapter 6, because I think it spoke to me like it spoke to a lot of our listeners that there is something valuable about operationalizing intelligence and ensuring that operations is constantly tied back to intelligence. So I kind of wanted to ask you, all three of you, that intelligence has this emphasis on fighting for intelligence. And it's got to be based on the assessments of the OE, both the current OE and the future OE. And how do we start talking about that more as a force? And what are we starting to see now with MDO coming up online?
So I can frame it broadly, and then maybe we get the specific piece of it. So it's there's two pieces of it. What kind of intelligence are you fighting to get? In other words, what information is it that we need that's a little bit different, perhaps, in large-scale combat operations than counterinsurgency or other types of lesser contingencies? And then there's a cultural aspect to it. This is not to disparage anybody by making a generalization that everybody's waiting around to be told, hey, where the high-value target is or anything like that. We all fought for information on the ground in these other places, but it looks different when you're involved in a large-scale conventional fight where the operational environment is extremely lethal. And so what you're fighting for, it may be very tactical or it may inform the operational level of events. But the systems employed both by us and against the threat need to be focused a little bit differently. And then the other part of the cultural aspect is educating ourselves, right? So you have to fight to educate yourself about certain things during professional military education. So there was a cultural norm in the old days, and I think you remember it, sir, because you're only commissioned a year ahead of me. I was expected as an armor officer, because and infantry officers were as well. I can't speak to everybody else from personal experience. But we were expected to memorize what the enemy weapon systems were and capabilities. And so that was one of the great things with intel lieutenants is they had a longer OBC than everybody else because they had a lot more stuff to memorize. But that continued through being a captain when you were still specifically focused on your branch and the knowledge, skills, and attributes for your specific branch up to company grade level. So we didn't depend on the S2 to tell us what the range of an AT-5 was, right? You were expected to know what that was. And so the two, or the intelligence expert at whatever echelon you're at, were really focused on courses of action. And what is the enemy going to do? You were expected to already know what he could do in terms of capabilities, at least within your own warfighting function. And as you got more and more mature, if you were a scout platoon leader or a cavalry troop commander, you had to have a little bit broader appreciation for that because you lived right in that spot where you were fighting for information. That was one of General Donahoe's favorite, talking points. The other piece is the roles of the echelons above brigade in terms of fighting for information. And so we had moved as an Army structurally away from a division, for example, being accustomed to fighting a division cavalry squadron or employing its aviation specifically for intelligence purposes, right? Because we were in fixed areas of operation, operating on a radius in an area that we were familiar with. In some cases, like in your case, sir, you might have been to the same spot multiple times on successive overseas deployments, so it's very different. So there's a whole bunch of things across the .mil PF that there's implications from the fighting for intelligence, and there's some of it's cultural, some of it's doctrinal, a lot of it's training, some of it's going to be organization, but some of it's, I think, a mindset too, which will drive all the rest of those things.
Rich, I had a flashback here of flashcards.
Yes, sir.
Back in 1991 when I went to OBC, learning those enemy threat systems.
I still have mine.
So he kind of gave me a flashback there. But I'd start, Nikki, by answering the question, fighting for intelligence. I tell lieutenants and captains right now in BOLIC and the MIC that as an intel officer, of course you're supposed to know the threat. You're supposed to know red. But to provide your commander that situational understanding, situational awareness so that he can have decision dominance, that intel officer also needs to know maneuver, the blue side of the house.
Yeah, Roger.
Okay?
Yeah.
So he's got to understand maneuver and he's got to understand threat. The intel guy's got to know red and blue, and he's trying to turn those gray icons that we can see on the battlefield red. And that leads me to, the triad of the S2, the S3, and the commander. If those three people in any organization at echelon are not in sync, then the plan could be derailed. I tell commanders all the time now, and we just came out of the ops block of ASEP-C where there were several division commanders, and what I told them was, hey, look, you've got to have your intel officer in your inner circle. And if they're not, you're doing a disservice to your organization. So then I'd kind of pile on to some of Rich's points. And so when you fight for intel, one, you have to know the intel cycle. Two, you have to know the intel assets that are available from tactical to strategic. And then how do you get access to, if I'm at the division level, how do I get access to some of those national assets that could potentially confirm or deny and help me turn a gray icon red? Whether it's SIGINT, HUMINT, ELINT, MINT, MTIs, moving target indicators, whether it's OSINT. In today's world, we have to use OSINT, heavily, whether it's GEOINT. You've got to understand all the different ints that can help you. And then, of course, as an intel officer, even, at the brigade and above echelon, you've got to know the intelligence community partners, the IC partners, and what those 18 different agencies could particularly bring to you. If you were able to tap into them, how to ask RFIs up the chain to get them in the system. But we've been dealing with COIN and counterterrorism operations for 2 decades, and our peer and near peer adversaries, as Rich mentioned, have been studying us the entire time. They've been making capability developments. They've been improving their armies. Their threat is now more lethal and more sophisticated. And so I think our adversaries who have studied us are better postured to kind of go after our strengths and also our weaknesses. So you look at what the peer and near threats have done here over the past 2 decades. They've improved their EW, their cyber, their IO, their space capabilities. They've improved their anti-access, anti-denial, A2AD, their IADs, their long-range precision fires. We're probably going to have to face that. Chief mentioned a while ago when Russia went into Crimea in 2014. Well, Russia's also done operations in the Ukraine since then. They've done operations in Syria. We've learned, from their operations. And then we look at what the Chinese are doing as well, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's the 9-dash line. They have made, and they started, several years ago, moving toward the BCT combat concept of warfighting, just like we were, because they were looking at our doctrine, and they wanted to be like us. So I would tell you, fighting for intelligence is tough sometimes. And that intel officer, of course, has got to be skilled, knowing blue and red. And he's got to know all the available resources that are there that could help them, confirm or deny for that commander so that they can make a decision and have decision dominance.
Yes, sir. So I think for me, having a look at Chapter 6 of FM 2.0, I think about it kind of like Mr. Cree did in 2 different segments. So the first segment would really be, the enemy situation that we're fighting against. And so what does that look like in LISCO and MDO? I think General Hale painted a pretty good picture of it. I think it's a situation where there's anti-access area denial bubbles, and then inside those bubbles, we're contested in all domains, so contested in space, in cyber, across the electromagnetic spectrum, land, air, maritime. Perhaps there's separatist forces operating on that battlefield. We're contested with our precision navigation and timing. Perhaps there's some jamming of the GPS, some spoofing, things like that. It's probably a hypervelocity environment where we're challenged from fort all the way to port. So a situation where we traditionally have not been in. And so I look at it in terms of the enemy and how we fight through that, and how we crack those A2AD bubbles, and how we start to get after the enemy. And then the other way I look at it is fighting ISR really as a staff, and what that strategy looks like. So do we have the right architecture in place? Do we have the right military intelligence systems? Do we have the right equipment? Do we have the correct transport layer to make sure that we're able to pass data up, down, and sideways into outside agencies? Do we have all those things? Because I don't believe there's probably a lack of data. I believe the question is, do we have the capability at echelon to process, exploit, and then disseminate that data? So that is a question. And then just making sure that as a staff, we're looking at the priority intelligence requirements, not just every intelligence requirement that's out there, but scoping in those PIR. So we're answering a commander's questions to allow them some decision space to make decisions on the battlefield. So that's kind of how I see fighting for intel.
While you all were talking, it occurred to me, sir, the tools we use are a little bit different than we had when we were doing this as a full-time focus, right? In some cases, they're far superior, or at least they seem to be, until you start putting them in the context of some of these threats, right? And so we've kind of had a bias towards aerial collection, for example, and using those kinds of platforms for a long time, which is fine in certain contexts. I mean, they certainly give you an advantage, and you're not putting people at risk as much. Now you found yourself in a situation where you had kind of put many of your eggs in one basket, and we didn't have any chickens hatching any other eggs anywhere. I think we've gotten after that after the last few years, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Rich, that's a good point. But what I would tell you is, although we've gotten after it in the last 3 years to make some of those modernization gains, it's going to take time to get there. Okay, so in the meantime, do we have air superiority for our aerial ISR assets, whether manned or unmanned? Everybody talks about space these days, and look at the different capabilities that our adversaries have in space. Talk about the comms network, okay? Talk about working through a contested, congested environment. They're going to be using cyber and EW against us just as we would them, but they're going to impact our collection capabilities. How long do you think it takes to set up a human network against a peer or near peer threat? You don't do that overnight. So where are you going to find the enemy? How are you going to turn those gray icons red when your capabilities are degraded? And I will tell you that although we're making great progress, and I think we'll talk about modernization a little bit later, but, we've got the largest modernization in the last 40 years, as I mentioned earlier, ongoing right now. But it's going to take a little time to field all that equipment at echelon, and especially Compo 2 and 3. And as we work through rearm and how that shakes out within the Army, there are going to be some units that are haves and some units that are have-nots, okay? And that causes you to look at the training. But it also goes back to your point, Rich, on the capability at echelon that you have to collect that intel. And I would say, fighting for intel is going to be much more important, and we'll probably see much more challenges as we move forward against a peer or near peer adversary. And you know that operational environment that Nikki spoke about earlier, as we look at our peer and near peer threats, totally different in Indo-Pacific than it is in the EUCOM AOR, and the fight that you're going to have there. So I think it's going to be really challenging, Nikki, and I think fighting for intelligence is going to be much more talked about in the future as we move forward due to that congested environment.
So, actually, I have a quick question on this one, because how often do I get a chance to get this much experience in the room? When you're talking about the idea of trying to find a way to get an asymmetric advantage over an enemy that has had a period to study us, and you're right, sir, we do have a gap of material solutions right now. While we're waiting to bring those systems up online, what can organizations at the, say, division corps level, if we were to look at divisions and corps as being tactical formations again, what would you advise commanders to start looking at as far as staff processes and practices to help at least bridge that gap a little bit?
So, if I may, just based on some of the reflections that we've seen at the different warfighters that General Hale and I have attended, I think we do very good, both in terms of red and blue intel, in terms of tube and rocket artillery and air-delivered effects in that piece of the air-land battle, if you will. What I think we still need to work on are having a space effect, having an effect in the information domain, having effect in the cyber domain, all within that scheme of maneuver. I think we have capability out there right now, so I don't think it's that we necessarily lack capability. I think we need to continue to work to fuse that capability so we have that effect in the scheme of maneuver, again, to allow commanders to execute their mission and have decision space. So I think there's capability out there, and we've in some of those areas we've done very well in developing, cyber being one of them. I just think we need to bring it all together, and so I think we probably need, I would say, more sets and reps. And I don't know if it's more warfighter exercises or what that training looks like, but we need more sets and reps in real time to be able to bring all those domains together to have an effect. Sir.
Yeah, so I would kind of look at it from a different perspective, piling on to what Chief just said. And to me it goes back to training, okay? So get your intel soldiers, out of their office, out from behind a non-intel computer, and get them operating their systems. I remember when I was a Turkey trailblazer platoon leader back in the day, and you went out and you actually did drills and you timed yourself on how long it took you to set up your equipment and get it operational and start collecting. We've got to be able to do that in a contested environment. We've got to have the sets and reps to do that. As I look at, Chief mentioned the staff process. You've got to know the staff process inside and out where you can do it in your sleep. You can't stall and think about something for an extended period of time, because you may lose an opportunity if your commander did make a decision to do something. And as I look at it, as we get towards, looking at the biggest challenges we're going to have, to me it goes back to the fundamentals. You've got to know how to do collection management. You've got to know how to manage your ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. You've got to know how to conduct the targeting cycle, to have your long-range shooters be able to engage, to have any of your assets engaged. You've got to be able to exercise that using all the ints. Chief mentioned cyberspace, etc. I use the term, you've got to be able to synchronize from mud to space in today's environment, because we're looking across 5 domains. Chief and I were talking as we prepped for this session, and Chief mentioned air-land battle. 2 domains is what we were focused on then. Well, now we're in 5 domains, and we've got to be able to synchronize it across all the domains as we move forward. So I go back to using the chief's words on sets and reps, and you got to get after it, and you got to have your intel soldiers doing intel, not doing something else. And sometimes, having been to FORCECOM G2, there was a lot of painting rocks and cutting grass and motor pool and not necessarily on your system. I can't tell you how many times I have visited NTC or JRTC, JMRC as a senior intel officer, and D6A is sitting in a box, not even connected. We got to get away from that. We cannot have that and cannot, allow that to happen in today's Army.
So you talk about those sets and reps, both of you, and that I think that's applicable to all the battle or all the warfighting functions. But the emerging FM30, we're bringing back tenets and imperatives. One of the tenets is agility, and agility is informed by those sets and reps that make you familiar enough to be able to execute processes as battle drills in much of the same way a platoon would execute their battle drills, like your Turkey platoon examples. And I think sometimes that does get lost on folks, that we're not just talking about infantry platoons and scout platoons that have drills. Everybody's got to have drills, and you got to measure them, right? Because there's no other way to judge whether you're getting better. And that gets to this multi-domain imperative that you have to operate as if or under the assumption that your friendly forces are always in contact. And certainly observation from space when contact in the EMS are examples where you can pretty much assume that that's true, whether you're in CONUS or anywhere else. And so not only should that drive you towards operating in a certain way, but it also should kind of motivate you, right? Because we can be assessed pretty simply, particularly if you're being watched. So we may assess ourselves a little more generously than the threat would. And so that's important too. So I just think it's interesting how that all comes together.
Rich, you're exactly right. General Flynn at USRPAC will tell you he's in competition every day, and so will General Cavoli over at USRAF. Competition every day, and they're watching everything that we're doing. And in some ways, I ask myself, are we doing the same? Because we're looking in multiple locations, of course, but our peer and near-peer adversaries are looking at the U.S., where we're looking at multiple nations, nation-states, et cetera, as we move forward.
So, I get the theme from all of this is the more things change, the more they kind of remain the same almost for all these decades. I'm not going to admit how many decades I've been doing this, but it's kind of refreshing almost to hear that. Still, at the same time, I think it's a good chance for us to talk about the capabilities that are being developed right now under what we call Waypoint 2028. But really, I think most folks, especially if they're younger listeners that aren't familiar with that term, this is kind of our modernization effort and this transition point that we're attempting to manage as an Army. And Doctrine alone is awesome. I love it. It's my thing. But these new technologies and systems that we're bringing up online and how we're going to employ them in operations has still got a lot of folks wondering what the future and what the modernization effort's going to look like. During previous podcasts, we've discussed this a lot, especially as it applies to LISCO, but here's a chance for us to really dial in on what the MI community is doing and how it's going to apply to operations in the future. Gentlemen, I want to ask you, what do you think of the process of building intelligence capabilities? And sir, how are your priorities and objectives working towards that effort as well?
Yeah, so Nikki, when I went out to USACO and Fort Huachuca, I kind of looked at what General Potter had been doing over the previous 15 months, and of course, in about halfway through her tenure there, COVID hit and kind of shut things down a little bit. So in some respects, I was given a fresh look at what was going on at the Intel Center in Fort Huachuca, and I actually came up with my 3 objectives. General Rainey is a big objective guy. He's not a line of effort person. So my 3 objectives and my 1 priority. And of course, you could probably guess that my 1 priority is people. With the Chief of Staff of the Army's people priority that came out during AUSA at 2019. So we've got to continue to invest in our people. The Intel Corps in particular has a low ratio of minorities in the Intel Corps, and I'm specifically focused on that as the CG of the Intel Center. But we've got to manage our talent. As I look at modernizing the Army, that revolves around what are we going to do with not only artificial intelligence, machine learning, to make sure that we kind of speed up all this intel that's falling on the floor. Okay, in any crisis or conflict, there's intel collection that falls on the floor. So what are we going to do to ensure that artificial intelligence, machine learning is integrated into Intel processes? And then in today's world, how are we going to implement open source intelligence and publicly available information? Because we can enrich our intelligence assessments through OSINT and PAI. As I looked at my three objectives, the one that gets towards the modernization is drive change. And that's objective number 2. Objective number 1 is build leaders. We've got to have great leaders in the Intel Corps that take us into the next century. You look at, being part of TRADOC, I look at General Funk's talent-based branching. A focal point for our MI officers is a more diverse representation of the demographics. So we've got to get back to recruiting the best and the brightest in our branch, and not only committed to recruiting them, but retaining them. As I look at driving change, so we're undergoing the largest modernization effort in 40 years. And from an organizational perspective, we now have the intelligence electronic warfare battalions at the divisions and the corps. We're also exploring, I don't want anybody to get excited here, exploring, potentially moving the MICOs, the MI companies, up to the IEW battalion. That'll get after some of the training readiness, some of the maintenance across the division. It'll also put a senior Command Select 05 in charge of that intel warfighting function at the division level. So we're looking at that. We've enhanced the Military Intelligence Brigade Theater, the MIB-T formation in INSCOM. This past fiscal year, they were increased by 77 personnel as we continue to build that out. We have stood up the multi-domain task force. That first one is up at JBLM with Jim Eisenhower. We're getting ready to stand up the next one this year for Europe and USARAF. That MDTF organization is one of the Army's top priorities. I think we're looking at building 5. Eventually, we'll get to 5. And then you look at the material. As you talk about, really our signature capability is going to be what we call Titan, the Tactical Intelligence Targeting Access Node. And that's going to bring together cyber, EW, SIGINT, and space in one vehicle. And so the chief has really jumped on the Titan. That's our signature model for modernization. We also have multi-domain sensing system that gets after that capability gap 1, deep sensing. We've got the T-List series, so we have T-List, terrestrial layer system BCT for the BCTs, and then we have T-List EAB for echelon above brigades, thanks the corps, the MDTFs for T-List EAB and the divisions, of course. And so I think that aligns well with the rearm campaign. But at the same time, we're doing intelligence rearm. How are we in line with rearm from an Army perspective for intel systems and capabilities, because we've got to be in sync as we move forward. So this modernization is going to allow commanders to see further. They're going to hopefully be able to understand sooner, and then have that situational understanding that they can share wider across the battlefield. And then for me, my third objective, just to complete that out, is my inform objective. And it really hit me the first trip I made from Fort Huachuca after taking over in August of 2020. And it was the fact that we have senior intel leaders, and I say a intel leader in the Intel Corps is Lieutenant Colonel CSL and above. We have senior intel leaders that don't even know what we're doing in our intelligence corps with regards to training or modernization. So how can they mentor their junior officers and soldiers if they don't have a clue what we're doing in our intel corps? So I've been really beating my head on the table to get from what I call the boardroom to the basement to ensure that all the intel soldiers at echelon understand what's going on in the intel warfighting function. And that's been a little bit difficult for me, having been in the SOF community for 5 years before coming to Fort Huachuca, not having any of the social media accounts. Now I have Facebook and Twitter and the Gram, and that was different for me because I didn't even use NIPR email address. I didn't really go to my NIPR email. So I would say from that perspective, build leaders, drive change, inform, keeping people first. We've got a lot going on in the Intel Corps. And events like this allow me to get on my inform objective to let everybody know what's going on. I'll pause there and pass it over to Chief. I told you before we started, when I get going, I kind of get going, getting my message out.
Well,
Chief.
Sir, that was a great rundown. Honestly, I don't think there's a whole lot for me to say in terms of materiel modernization, but I did want to hit a couple things. And one of them goes back to Mr. Creed's point about us evaluating ourselves. And so one of the things that we've developed over the last several years is a military intelligence training strategy. We call it MITS. And that's a tiered system, so it goes from individual certification to crew certification to platform certification, and then finally to the warfighting function certification. So 4 different levels, and it puts some rigor into that training that we're doing. And so that's kind of part of our modernization effort as well, and we continue to mature that process moving forward. You could think of it as a gunnery, if you will, so table 4, table 8. We talk about having crews associated with our different platforms. So that's one of the ways that we're getting after that. And then to drive that, we have our Intelligence and Electronic Warfare Troop Proficiency Trainer, or IEW-TPT, and that provides an ability to simulate and also stimulate our intelligence systems. And so we continue to work on that. Another critical capability that we're rolling out is Capability Drop 2, which will be a replacement for our IFS servers, our Fusion servers, as well as our multifunction workstations. We should have some information with regard to the vendor for that in the next few days coming up. So look forward to that. But that really is still in the test, fix, test process as we go forward. And so I thought that was good. I would like to pitch it back to you, sir, if you want to talk about the multi-domain range. I think that's probably pretty important to talk about as well.
Yeah, great, Chief. And, I actually just laid out the multi-domain operations range that we're building at Fort Huachuca to both General Martin and General Potter in the last week. And so, Fort Huachuca has been the testing site in the electromagnetic spectrum for decades. And the Electronic Proving Ground, EPG, does underneath ATEC, the Army Testing Evaluation Command, does testing on all of our electromagnetic systems. T-List BCT is in the range complex right now doing testing with 2 different vendors before we do a down select. We also have our IEW test directorate at Fort Huachuca that does a lot of testing. We have our JITIC, the Joint Interoperability Test Command at Fort Huachuca, which is a joint organization commanded by a Navy captain. And then we have our ISEC, Information Security Command, as well, that does a lot of testing for the Army, for the different CFTs. And we use what we call right now the Buffalo Soldier Electronic Test and Training Range. So what's so significant about Fort Huachuca? Well, we're in southern Arizona. You really got to want to come to Fort Huachuca to come to Fort Huachuca, because if you leave from Fort Leavenworth, where you're located at, Nikki, it takes you about all day to get there, okay? We're in southern Arizona, like I said, about 15 miles by the way the crow flies to Mexico. And we're actually in a bowl surrounded by mountains. We have about 1,000 square miles of restricted airspace over Fort Huachuca. So when I go out into our training range and I fire off electrons, whether it be EW, cyber, etc., SIGINT, guess what? Those electrons aren't going to interfere with any air corridor that services a major airport. They're not going to interfere with any major metropolitan area. Sierra Vista is, a small town within Cochise County. I think the population is somewhere around 20,000 or so, 25,000 outside of the gate. Okay, so it's not a large area. Tucson's the closest. So what we're doing at the Buffalo Soldier Electronic Test and Training Range is really making that an MDO capable range, where I tell folks to close their eyes, imagine a unit flying in on their C-17. We have a 12,003-foot runway. Used to be the alternate landing location for the space shuttle program. Imagine your MI troopers or your EW or cyber troopers flying in, landing on our runway, going out into East Range with their equipment and training at the squad, platoon, company level, right out there in East Range, shooting electrons all over the terrain without interfering with anybody. We can put threat emitters out in the range complex that we're developing with Arizona State University and the University of Arizona that are about the size of the laptop in front of you, that will emulate SA-16, 18, S-400. Think about, in this coming year, we're going to actually be in Project Convergence 21, where we're going to have a threat system emulated from Fort Huachuca that's going to be in the campaign of learning there. But just think about where you can come and actually test, use your equipment, not have to worry about any regulations that are being violated, especially within the electromagnetic spectrum. And we were approved at the POM planning task by the chief last year, and we're moving out in coordination with Chuck Lombardo and the CAC-T team. We're already a major range training complex already. So it's a great time to be at Fort Huachuca, especially as we move toward Waypoint 2028 and Aimpoint 2035 in multi-domain operations.
It's funny you should mention that. So I remember as a very young pilot flying against the aircraft survivability equipment trainer. And in order to get again, it basically was meant to replicate an IADS threat. And that was multiple Humvee-based systems and trailers. To think that it would go down to a laptop increases opportunity, and I think really increases capacity for us to continue training.
So Nikki, I'm glad you brought that up. So the way we're looking at it is range in a box. So think of a Connex that's got dozens of these laptops in it, that you can pull out and set up in your training area, whether it's at a core location, JBLM. We've done some testing up at JBLM with the Multi-Domain Task Force, or at Fort Hood or at Fort Bragg, put out at the CTCs. Think about fast movers that are supporting a CTC rotation, and they get some training because it's CTC, NTCs connected with Fort Huachuca, with White Sands, etc., Yuma, and think about the training that could be provided to them. Right now, we've got USAPAC out doing some testing at Fort Huachuca. We've got Naval Special Warfare out doing some testing at Fort Huachuca, as well as some of our RSOF, our Army SOF folks from the 160th as well.
So I'm going to bring us all back to kind of where we first started. You guys made a mention of the deck of cards that a lot of us got, which was the identify your threat, and it was all Soviet-based equipment, and that was part of our professional development. So with all this experience in the room, what do we think is probably the best way to go with continuing professional development for our field grades, especially the guys who just started over at Lewis and Clark Center with the new class of CGSOC students? How should they be thinking about their professional development as it applies to intel and operations?
Well, I'll throw out something from the maneuver guy perspective, right? Because there's three things that you hear screamed in a talk, at least the battalion and brigade level. It's where's the two, where's the SIGO, and where's the chemo, right? And so at the lower tactical echelons during our experiments with modularity, you had special troops battalions, right? And that's what I commanded in Korea, was a special troops battalion. So I had a signal company, an MI company, chemical company. So it was kind of like karma for being mean back when I was a captain and a major. And so one of the things that was I found that was very important to do is the last thing you want to be on a large-scale combat battlefield is look special, because when you look special, you get shot first, right? And so one of the training things that we did, and I did within that battalion, was to ensure that my soldiers that manned Prophet and were humaners and did these other things could integrate very cleanly into the maneuver formations that they supported and did not stick out. In other words, they looked like infantrymen, they acted like infantrymen when they weren't behind or riding on the platform, that they could move their vehicles in a tactical manner. And so they were special, but they blended right in with the team because that joint and combined arms approach to operations that underpins all of our doctrine and the way that the U.S. Army wants to fight is heavily dependent on to be able to integrate those capabilities at echelon. And people like to use the word seamless. There's no such thing as seamless unless you get those reps and sets that the chief brought up earlier. And so I would throw that in there. The other piece is, and I think it's incumbent upon the maneuver community to do this, but if you're always yelling, particularly at the battalion level where you've got a great disparity in rank, right? So you have majors on the brigade staff can talk to the colonel or the lieutenant colonel, the battalion commanders. There's a closer degree, but when you're perhaps a first lieutenant or a captain and you got a battalion commander, that's a pretty intimidating situation to find yourself in, right? I mean, you're speaking truth to power all the time. Every time you execute the military decision-making process and you're back briefing your IPB bits there, that's an opportunity to learn. And so I think we could do a better job there within all of the communities of, one, coaching our twos, our MI officers about what we want, right? Just don't say, go out there and do great things. You need to coach and develop them from the maneuver perspective. And then we could do a better job of educating those officers about what the expectations are, because they're going to be a little bit different at every echelon. That's just my observations over time.
Yeah, Rich, I'll jump right on there. And, you talked about what a soldier looks like, okay? So, the first thing I would say is that every intel soldier needs to be able to shoot, move, communicate, medicate. And that's the fundamental of being a soldier. What I tell lieutenants and captains at BOLIC and the MIC is that don't go into your boss, that lieutenant colonel you were just talking about, trying to impress them with this gee whiz intel geek talk. Talk like a maneuver commander. You have to talk like them. You may have, found out your information from space through the Titan, etc. But tell the commander, here's where the enemy is. Here's what he wants to do to you. Here's how he's going to kill you. And this is the most dangerous course of action. And a lot of times, lieutenants and captains in particular, they in today's generation of lieutenants and captains, they want the answer. What is the answer that solves the problem? Well, guess what? In our, jobs, in our world, there are a lot of different variables that have an impact on the answer. Right. And they want the cookie cutter solution. Well, the threat gets a vote. And I tell, intel officers all the time, the threat gets a vote. So it's not a cookie cutter solution. Nikki, back to you with the students in CGSC right here at Fort Leavenworth. I go back to growing up and, there being some requirement to self-study, okay? So I've got to do some self-study on my own. I would encourage all intel professionals, but all Army officers and soldiers to be learning something new every day. Read something that's not the intel for an intel officer or your email. Read something different, because that's where you get different ideas from, good ideas. But to always be self-studying. And, I just read Admiral McRaven's book, I think it was The Honor Code, okay? And he laid out 10 different examples of honor. And it was just a fascinating story. Each one, talked about loyalty and selfless service and courage and things like that. But it was a story that went with each one. So always be reading something. But that self-study also includes doctrine. We mentioned earlier that the new Draft 3.0 is out. So guess what's in my bag that I'm taking along on road trips as I'm doing most of the month? It's something to read on the airplane, right? And Rich didn't create a podcast of 3.0 being read to me, so I'm having to read it.
Get right on that, sir.
Yeah. So I'm reading that draft because what did General Rainey just asked on Monday? Have you read 3.0 yet? Well, yes, sir. I just got my copy last week, and I'm getting to it and going through it. But self-study, and then always, the fundamentals are the fundamentals. They haven't changed. These intel cycle, IPB, military decision-making process, that's the fundamentals. You got to know that cold. But then, you also can learn from each other. Learn in your study groups. Learn in your small groups, because everybody's got different experiences. Some people may not have served in a different echelon of the intel warfighting function, or different echelon in the Army, whether it be BCT, Division, Corps, etc. There's a difference between what happens in Intelligence and Security Command versus what happens in ForceCom. All right, so learn from each other, learn from your peers. But every intel officer, every intel soldier's got to be a soldier first. That shoot, move, communicate, medicate. We run our lieutenants through the night combat course. And I will tell you, the first time I went out to observe that, and it's a night obstacle course, but you have pyro and blanks going off, and it's pitch dark, and you're crawling underneath concertina wire. And the first time I looked at a BOLIT course of 54 lieutenants in pitch black dark, they were looking back at me, and it looked like a bunch of stunned mullets because they didn't know what they had just been through. But learn from each other and build that confidence as you be an intel professional?
I do have a couple thoughts on that. From a schoolhouse perspective, I mentioned that I was a platform instructor. I was also a course manager. Out at Fort Huachuca, we run multiple IET, or IMT rather, and PME courses. So we work very hard to scaffold those courses from the 10 level, all the way through our warrant officers to make sure that it's a building block and we're not teaching redundancy out there at the schoolhouse, along with our lieutenants and captains as well. And I would even go as far as to say the pre-command course that we run out there, we try to make sure all of that is scaffolded. We do that through the CTSSB process, critical site selection, Site Selection Task Board, yeah, that's it. And so we go through that very deliberate process to make sure that what we're teaching out there meets the needs of the Army. So to meet the needs of the Army, how do we get after that? Well, we are in constant communication with our Intelligence and Security Command, constant communication with our FORCECOM G2s, with our FORCECOM units, with the FORCECOM operators, with USASOC, making sure that as we train and put either soldiers out into the force or back into the force, that they have the latest on what the threat is, that they have the latest on multi-domain intelligence, that they have the latest in intelligence architecture. So we deliberately go through and making sure we're getting after some of these things, and then taking it a step further, making sure that we're getting after things like OSINT PAI, making sure that we're getting after artificial intelligence, machine learning, all these different things, making sure that we're moving forward to the future. I would tell you on the warrant officer side of the house, we're working very closely with CW5 Kilgore here at CAC. We're tightly nested in with the warrant officer PME modernization that he's kind of leading the charge on. We've looked at that very closely. We've got our briefs prepped and we're ready to go whenever it is that we brief. I would tell you that as an MI Corps, going back to 2016 for our warrant officers, we've worked very hard and we've husbanded some resources and got resources internally to make sure that we can, again, put out that best product out on the street. So we've created a phase 3 for our warrant officer level, our warrant officer intermediate level education, as well as our warrant officer senior service education. We have those in place right now, and all the feedback that we get on the QAO surveys is we are definitely heading in the right direction with that. So always room to improve the foxhole, but at least for our warrants, I think we're in a pretty good spot.
That's awesome. So I think we're gonna wrap it up, but I want to ask each of you one kind of last question about the future of all of this against the backdrop of MDO, and especially I just came from Defender Pacific 21, where I got the chance to watch First Corps working with USERPAC and also working through the wickets of the MDTF. So how do we see emerging intelligence capabilities, and where do we think intelligence is going for the Army in the future? Start off with you, sir.
Yeah, so Nikki, that's a great final question here. And I think, as we look at competition, crisis, and conflict, as we backdrop multi-domain operations to 5 domains and what we're doing in our modernization posture, as we've talked about throughout this podcast here, one, the fundamentals are still the fundamentals. Training is still training, and you got to do the sets and reps that the chief talked about first. Intelligence, I would say, and I grew up, intel drives ops. So I'm going to answer your question here at the end, but intel drives ops. If you don't know where the enemy is, a maneuver commander, you're not going to be able to kill him, and you're not going to be able to accomplish your mission. So intel drives ops, and within a theater, we look at intelligence setting that theater as a common start point. So, we look at exactly what's going on in each particular theater. And we have organizations within the intel community that do that every day. I got up this morning and I saw that both North Korea and South Korea had launched missiles. We look at that every day. I'm sure we had some warning on that. Intelligence is continuous in competition. We never, as General McChrystal said, as commander of JSOC, it's the unblinking eye. Intelligence is the unblinking eye. In competition, intelligence is continuous. It goes right into crisis, right into conflict. The importance of our allies and partners can't be understated. We have intelligence sharing agreements with all of our allies and partners. In some respects, they have additional capabilities that potentially we don't have because maybe they're not regulated by law like we are in some cases. As we look to modernize our equipment from the Intel Core, the largest modernization in the last 40 years, really modernizing from mud to space, as I talked about earlier. But look at the new capabilities we're bringing online, whether it's the multi-domain task force with an Intel capability, whether it's a theater fire cell with an Intel capability, whether it's an information advantage activity. Everybody wants Intel. Everybody wants more Intel. And for me, we're in a growth industry for everybody wanting Intel. But we know our top line of soldiers isn't going to increase and could potentially decrease. So we've got to make sure we've got the right Intel professional at the right location doing the right job. As we continue to update our doctrine, as 3.0 draft is out, we'll update 2.0 very quickly and make sure that we are focused on multi-domain operations. But, as I mentioned earlier, two different theaters, Indo-Pacific and EUCOM. You're talking about basically in the EUCOM AOR, a peer-on-peer land fight. When you look at the Indo-Pacific, that's more island hopping. I don't think we're going to be able to mass capabilities like we would do in the EUCOM AOR. And then I think the final thought I would have is, Intel professionals have to be able to synchronize that tactical to national collection of all the INTs and use all the IC partners, as the Resolute Support J2 in Afghanistan from May of 18 to September of 19. That's what I had to do every day. And granted, I was looking at one JOA there in Afghanistan with multiple countries of interest surrounding it, but I was having to synchronize from tactical to national what was going on and how those impacts were happening on the ground in Afghanistan. So I think it's a great time to be an Intel professional. We're hiring, and we definitely want the best and brightest in the Intel Core.
Well, thanks again. Excuse me. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I thought it's been a great session so far. I guess I would frame your question in terms of the couple of papers that the Chief of Staff of the Army put out back in March. So if you look at what our near-peer competitors continue to do, they continue operations inside the gray zone. They continue to weaponize instruments of national power. They continue to blur the line between conflict and peace. And so I guess in the short term, I think we need to look at that in terms of competition. I think in the longer term, certainly we get to LISCO and multi-domain operations. As we look at the Pacific, I think there's a lot of geography there. It's a lot of complex battlefield geometry as well. And I think the capabilities that we're building, I think they need to be redundant. I think they need to be nimble. I think that they need to be able to sense deep. I think we're on the right track with the multi-domain task force, with the multi-domain exploitation battalion, formerly I2Qs, theater fires command, things like that. I think we're on the right track with those. But I think we have to get more. We have to get faster. We have to get more lethal. As Intel, we have to enable the kill web, making sure we have the right shooter looking at the right target at the right time. I think we need to focus on information advantage. And I think we need to, as I talked about earlier, make sure that as we train, we're looking at coordinating all of those effects at the same point inside the scheme maneuver. So that's what I have. Again, thanks for the opportunity.
Chief almost left me with nothing to say. You ticked off almost every box on the MDO and FM30 checklist there. Hey, I think just two broad points. One, Intel helps us see ourselves, see the threat, and then understand the operational environment, and that's fundamental to our approach to any operational environment, but specifically the one in the near and long term. And 3.0 addresses that specifically, and the 2 series publications do as well. And what we're looking from a doctoral standpoint is to make sure we're consistent across the 3 series pubs where it's appropriate, depending on the subject matter, to make sure we kind of have this uniform approach and this common understanding. The other thing is everyone always asks, well, I need to do some multi-domain stuff. When's my multi-domain stuff going into Doctrine? You know, it's like more cowbell in the old Saturday Night Live skit. And it kind of drives you nuts because it makes you realize people don't really understand the idea. The one exception would be the Intel warfighting function. A multidisciplinary approach to intelligence is inherently a multi-domain approach to intelligence. And so I would offer that of all the warfighting functions, we may have some gaps in capabilities or training or so forth, but it's always been a multi-domain warfighting function. The other is this idea, and it applies to everybody, and I think there's probably some unique aspects to intelligence, but you know, this whole idea that culture eats strategy or planning for breakfast. And so there's some cultural things we have to get after, and I think it's as much an intel thing as it is a commander and staff thing across all the warfighting functions. It's this idea that commanders need to drive the intelligence process, and they need to be intellectually curious enough about the capabilities that are available to ask the right questions, or to ask any questions at all, and then drive what's available instead of waiting to be told, and expect the intelligence staff or an intelligence unit to kind of figure it out on their own. And you can't just do it once. I think it's got to be iterative, like we talked about in ASEP-C. So that's like kind of like where an old tanker would come from on this.
Sir, I'm going to leave the last parting shots to you. Anything you got for the community out there?
Wow, Nikki, this has been a great session, and I really appreciate you and Rich Creed helping Chief Anderson and I talk about the intelligence warfighting function. It's exciting to be the CG of the Intel Center. When I get to see privates to colonels every day learning their craft, it's exciting to be involved in all of the training that we're doing and updating training. You know, I mentioned training some of the training hadn't been changed in 2 decades, and we've got several pilots that are ongoing right now that changes the way we train Intel soldiers, and then the modernization. And you know, I was able to crawl over and under and on top of the T-list BCT about 6 weeks ago out at Fort Huachuca before it went out in the range. But seeing some of the capability that's going to come online, that's going to get after that multi-domain operations, it's just impressive. And making sure our Intel soldiers are ready to perform, of course, is my job, and it's exciting every day. But I really appreciate the opportunity to inform. Objective number 3 for me, inform everyone about what's going on in the Intel warfighting function.
If I've got to fight through a transition in the Army, it's good to know that I'm fighting along with some awesome people from the Intel branch. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming out today.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you. If I did have one alibi, it would be Critical Task Site Selection Board, which I could not get out of my mouth earlier.
So we'd also like to thank our listeners for joining us today, and I'd like to thank Captain Wyatt Harper, who has been our sound recorder and also our producer for this episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, you should hit the subscribe button at either Apple or Google Podcasts, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, U.S. Army Doctrine, for updates on our new episodes, as well as Doctrine Digest video shorts, audiobooks, and most importantly, New Doctrine. You can also follow the Intelligence Center of Excellence and Major General Hale. They're at U.S. Army ICO, and U.S. Army ICO _CG for updates to the intel community. And finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Dean, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.